Welcome to the Wreck Silence Review Show. We're still going strong in Horror Month, continuing with our reviews of the Poltergeist franchise. Thus far, we've covered the 2015 remake and the 1982 original. This week, we'll be reviewing the next installment, Poltergeist 2: The Other Side. And when people talk about the all-time greatest sequels in film history, we hear titles like T2 Judgment Day, Empire Strikes Back, Wrath of Khan, and of course the greatest film of all time, The Godfather Part 2. But I noticed that for horror films, the classic ones had some pretty good sequels too, at least early on. Halloween 2, Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Friday the 13th 3, all really good follow-up films to their original iterations. But sadly, no one ever mentions Poltergeist 2 when referencing great horror sequels. Personally, not only do I think this is a great sequel, but this is one of those rare cases where the sequel is even better than the original in some ways. The only other times I can actually think of are with Halloween 2, Terminator 2, and Godfather 2. The reason these sequels were so well received is due to the fact that they furthered the story by building on what came before, without repeating themselves outright, while adding to each film's mythology and still feeling like they take place in the same world. I 1000% believe that to be the case for Poltergeist 2. Not only did they continue the story while retroactively establishing a lore behind the first film's events, not only did they manage to make this one even creepier, not only did they manage to keep the same tone, but they managed to do it without Spielberg and Hooper. With Michael Gryce and Mark Victor returning as writers and producers, director Brian Gibson replaces Tobe Hooper behind the camera. The entire cast of the Freeling family return, with the exception of eldest daughter Dana Freeling, portrayed by the late Dominique Dunne, who was tragically murdered shortly after the first film's release. New cast members include Geraldine Fitzgerald and Kelly Jean Peters as both the young and elderly versions of Grandma Jess, Will Sampson as Taylor the Medicine Man, and Julian Beck in his final role as Reverend Henry Kane, aka the Beast. Set roughly a year after the first film's events, the Cuesta Verde neighborhood where the Freeling family home once stood has been turned into an archaeological dig site. An excavation by a ground crew reveals the discovery of a cave, whose existence is then discovered by clairvoyant psychic Tangina Barons from the first film. She then relays this information to her friend and newly introduced character, Taylor, a Native American medicine man. After inspecting the site for himself, he comes to the realization that the spirit of Reverend Henry Kane is once again after Carol Ann Freeling. Thus, he rushes to their current home to defend her and the Freeling family. After the traumatizing events of the first film, the Freeling family has relocated to Phoenix, Arizona, where they now live in a house with Diane's mother, Jess. As it turns out, Grandma Jess is highly clairvoyant, an ability she believes she passed on to both her daughter and granddaughter, retroactively explaining why Carol Ann was able to communicate with the spirits in the first film, and why Diane was the one who had to go to the other realm to save her. Sadly, Grandma Jess passes away early on in the film's runtime, and shortly after, Taylor arrives to help the distraught family, just as Kane begins his first assault on them. This time, Kane is unable to penetrate the home through the television, as the family previously had them all removed from the house out of precaution. So instead, he tries to enter through Carol Ann's toy phone. What? Which also fails. Not sure why he thought that would work. Anyway, the family quickly exits the home, where they're introduced to Taylor, who informs them their running would be a waste of time, since Kane would be able to find them no matter where they went. A few days later, Kane shows up at the Freeling house, this time in his human form of Reverend Henry Kane, the psychotic cult leader masquerading as a preacher. Now in this film, he's played by the magnificent Julian Beck. His portrayal of Reverend Kane is honestly a huge part of what elevates this film beyond the first one in quality. In part 1, we saw Kane in an abstract form, the apparition known as the Beast. But here we actually get to put a face to that evil force, and it really turns things up to 11. You can really tell that Beck is enjoying the hell out of this role. I bet he scared the shit out of any kids who were extras on the set. Unfortunately, this would be Beck's final role. as he was dying and in the final stages of stomach cancer, and would tragically pass away a year before this film's release. But he left us with one hell of a chilling final performance. Rest in peace, Mr. Beck. As he approaches closer and closer to the Freelings' front door, he starts reciting some creepy religious chant, and it starts to rain and thunder. They recognize him as the man they saw in public while shopping a few days prior. He confronts Steve about Taylor, who's been staying with the Freelings to protect them, and whom they've taken a liking to. He tries to make Taylor out to be the villain in disguise. But come on, guy. Who the fuck would ever trust a creepy-looking bastard like this? Straight out of Tales of the fucking Crypt. Even the most naive soul on this earth would take one quick look at this face and know to stay far the fuck away. As the rest of the family retreats into the house, he attempts to use his cult-like powers of persuasion to make his way inside. For a minute, he seems to have Steve under his control of suggestion, but he manages to break free, thus angering Kane as he disappears, taking the storm with him. Later that night, he terrorizes them once again, appearing in their home in apparition form, taunting them that they cannot keep Carol Ann from him. He even attacks Robbie by having his braces spiral and sprawl out of his mouth, covering the entire bathroom, and attempting to enter the power outlet to electrocute both he and the parents. In response to this, Taylor takes Steve to some deserted plains where they proceed to toke up the peace pipe. Who knew that getting high could solve everyone's problems? So I guess the purpose of this was for Taylor to tell Steve that the family's strong love for one another is what has kept Kane from taking Carol Ann up to this point, but that Steve's insecurities that he can't protect his family is what Kane will exploit as a vulnerability to gain the upper hand. Meanwhile, back at the house, Diane is greeted at the front door by a surprise guest visitor, Tangina Barons, who returns from the first film. She gives Diane a brief history of Kane's backstory, informing her that he was an insane preacher from the 1800s who traveled from the South with a congregation of his followers to California, all while preaching about the apocalypse to come. As mentioned earlier on, Diane's mother Jess possessed clairvoyant abilities which she believed she passed to Diane and Carol Ann. Being aware of this, Tangina shows her an old picture of Reverend Henry Kane, and urges her to use those abilities to see if she can conjure any information from the image. After some initial denial and resistance, she's able to do so, and we witness Reverend Henry Kane as he arrives in California, rounding up his followers and sealing them away into an underground cove, along with himself. As time passes and the foretold apocalypse did not, some of Kane's followers became weary of his beliefs and wanted to leave, but were forced to stay and die along with everyone else. We don't actually see this part on screen. It's just explained through exposition, as we see the ever-increasingly delusional Kane chanting something to his followers while in the underground cove. Beck is having the time of his life with this performance, and it really comes off like all hope is lost and just misery remains, as we see a bunch of the cult children crying, while some of their hands reach out to Kane. I bet these kids hadn't have to be told to act at all during the scene. Kane is the devil every child sees in their nightmares. Later that night, Steve returns home without Taylor, who decided to stay behind in the plains. His absence is felt amongst the family as he had started to grow on them, but without him there to protect them, Kane prepares to make his next move. Steve, very much drowning those insecurities in the bottom of a tequila bottle, gets completely faded, and before he can take the last swig, we see Kane possess the worm at the very bottom of the bottle. Thus, when Steve swallows the worm in that last swig, Kane is able to possess him. He starts chanting, "God is in his holy temple," and ends up attacking Diane. Pretty goddamn viciously too, like this was an aggressively intense scene. Both of these actors were really in the moment here when the director said action. After some struggling, Diane is able to get through to Steve by assuring him that she and the family love him. He then regurgitates the worm, which has evolved into this grotesque, slimy, parasitic monster with a sinister face. The legendary H.R. Geiger did the creature designs for this film, and good God did he do a great fucking job. All the spirits of Kane's followers can be seen slowly approaching the home. Steve and Diane frantically search for the children, They find Robbie hiding in the pantry, and a few moments later, Carol Ann locked in the car. After Steve is able to convince her to unlock the door, they struggle to get the car to move while the spirits attack them with a chainsaw and actual chains, grabbing the bumper, physically stopping them from leaving the garage. Once they manage to escape, they decide the only course of action they can take at this point is to confront Kane on his own turf where this all started, as they return to the location where their original home once stood, in the Cuesta Verde housing development. When they arrive to find that it's become an archaeological dig site, they enter to find Taylor and Tangina awaiting them. They explore the site and come across the skeletons of Kane's followers and then Kane's corpse itself, which pulls Carol Ann and Diane into the spirit realm. Taylor summons a portal, and we see a horrific totem pole of spirit faces appear before them, with Carol Ann amongst them, pleading for her father's help. Yet again, another amazingly grotesque design by H.R. Geiger. Steve and Robbie enter the spirit realm and find Diane, and a few moments later when they find Carol Ann, the Totem of Souls appears with Kane's face visibly in control as he attempts to abduct her, with her turning into a barren corpse right before their eyes as he drains the life from her. But Steve stabs the pole with the spear Taylor had given him earlier, and Kane is defeated once and for all. But Carol Ann disappears into the void, while we simultaneously see Taylor in the normal world saying that he can no longer feel her presence. But just a moment later, we see her emerge from an erupting bright light, which happens to be the spirit of Grandma Jess guiding her back to the family. They return to the world of the living, thank Taylor by giving him their car, and the credits roll. Now, when this film was initially released, apparently it was hated by most of the general public and critics alike. Now, I can't speak to the degree of accuracy of that statement as I hadn't been born yet, but that's what most documentations show. And honestly, I can't fathom why, other than maybe because Spielberg and Hooper weren't involved this time around creatively. I don't know. I love this film. To me, it's a horror classic just like the first one. Not many horror films manage to not only get a sequel right, but in some ways, do it even better than the original. If you've only seen the first one and were on the fence about checking this one out, I say give it a watch. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. If you haven't seen either, check them both out this Halloween, or whenever you have the chance to. Overall, is it better than the first film as a whole? No. No one can compare it to the macabre and sense of wonder and storytelling that Hooper and Spielberg brought to the original. But as a follow-up to such a great film, it's more than a worthy successor. It took ideas from the first film, expanded upon them, and retroactively gave a lot more depth to the narrative of that film by relaying the backstory in this one. And considering what we've seen happen countless times when a sequel to a Spielberg film is made without his participation, I'd say that the directors, the writers, and the producers had a pretty decent understanding of what made the first film so good. They could have easily thrown out all of the narrative elements of the first film and done something completely different that likely could have tarnished its legacy. But fortunately, we got a sequel that was made with care and effort, and that respects its origins while contributing to them. Now, has public opinion changed towards this film now that close to 40 years has passed? I don't know. If you grew up with this film and your opinion on it's different today than it was back then, please leave a comment below. I'm interested to know why it has or hasn't changed. I hope you all enjoyed this review, and I hope you'll join me next week as we review the final film in the trilogy, Poltergeist 3. Unfortunately, this film here is the last time that we'd see the original cast together, just one of the many issues that plagued the deeply troubled production of the third and final installment. But we'll get to that next week. Also, we'll finally discuss the infamous Poltergeist curse that has plagued the production of all three of these films. I'd like to take the time to thank my editor for all his hard work. Thank you, this wouldn't be possible without you. And to also thank you all for your time. I sincerely appreciate it. Join me next week as we finally reach the end of Poltergeist month with a review of the final film. Take care, everyone.